Hi, my name is Rose Ernst, and I'm an academic editor, writer, and coach. And I'm also an former associate professor of political science and chair at Seattle University. And I'm here today to talk to you about your academic writing superpowers, also sometimes called Gallup-Clifton Strengths Finder. You may have heard of this particular assessment. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about how we can use Gallup-Clifton Strengths as a tool to understand academic writing and to really embrace and improve and enjoy our academic writing. So before I get into some of the details, I'll give you a little bit of background on how I came to Gallup-Clifton Strengths. I'm now a Gallup certified coach, and what I found in my time in the academy and as chair was that I struggled with academic writing, and I watched my colleagues struggle as well. And I found that we really struggled around issues having to do with pervasive types of culture in the academy, specifically around things related actually to white supremacy culture and various forms of systematic oppression, most specifically involving perfectionism, and I would say paternalism, and also either-or thinking, which has to do with sort of a one-size-fits-all model for how we produce scholarship and what kind of scholarship is valued and how much scholarship we have to produce. So I really wanted to focus on what actually made us thrive as academic writers rather than what our weaknesses were or what we perceived our weaknesses to be. So that's really how I arrived at Clifton Strengths, and part of my job now is to help you kind of translate Gallup's language, which is really focused, I would say, on the corporate world, into language that makes sense for academics and professors, right? So that's kind of my job in bringing you academic superpowers today. And so let's talk a little bit about some definitions. So let's start off with how Gallup defines what a strength is. And in general, whenever I refer to a strength, that is Gallup's registered trademark. And so the material that I cite here refers to them. And then I build off of that and sort of translate it, as I said, for academics. So coming out of the basically positive psychology movement, Gallup is really interested in understanding what brings us energy and what makes us successful and what makes us thrive in the workplace. And so they've done many studies regarding strengths in the workplace and have done this on a global level as well. And so they define a strength as a talent, a natural way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. And you multiply that times an investment, which is time spent practicing, developing your skills, and building your knowledge base. And this equals what they call a strength or strength themes, as we'll talk about. There are 34 strength themes. And this is the ability to consistently provide near perfect performance. Okay? And as far as talent goes, we can think of these things as, innate strengths, however you view that, potentially the product of very early childhood experiences, right? So the way that I like to think about this is a little bit different, but it's very similar. It's just in terms of wording and framing. So thinking about what are your innate gifts and talents, if you will, right? And how can you cultivate them? So we cultivate things and we grow things by understanding them, right? And actually putting them into practice. So you learn about them and then you put them into practice, and it's an iterative process, right? And that equals what I call your superpowers. And the reason I like the language of superpowers rather than strengths per se is that it really emphasizes that this is really a very special trait. And it's not to be taken lightly, and it's also not to be taken for granted. So we often operate as if the way that our brain functions is the way that everyone else's brain functions, which we know is not the case, right? But it's hard to know how other people's brains are functioning because we're not inside of them. So what strengths allows you to do is to really appreciate how uniquely you function right? And how uniquely others function as well. So once you get to understand some of these individual strengths and how they're combined together, you'll start to notice them in your colleagues. And what I find is that I have a lot more compassion for other people when I begin to understand that, for example, this person is taking a long time to make a decision because of their strengths, and that this actually will save us a lot of time and heartache in the long run. So once I do that, then it opens up so many different doors for focusing, again, not only on what's positive on my part, what brings me joy, but then sort of in a group sense, both like in your department and the university, and then also in terms of writing partners. All right. So let's talk a little bit, just briefly give you an overview of the actual assessment itself, which you can take, right? And these are the 34 strength themes that Gallup has identified through research. And again, it's important to understand Gallup has plenty of information about the validity of their study if you'd like to go take a look at that. For me, I am not particularly interested in that. I am a social scientist, and I know very well the history of standardized tests and how problematic they are. The reason that I believe in strengths is that I believe it's a tool that we can use to better understand ourselves and, again, bring more joy to our writing and to produce better scholarship in writing. And so I'll talk a little bit about how you can make strengths your own. But the point is, it's just a tool to help you get somewhere. So whether or not it is actually technically, scientifically valid is of less interest to me as a coach. I'm more interested actually in what are the results that people see in when they identify and use their strengths. So if you look at this is my strengths report, and we have 1 through 10, right? Those are your top 10 strengths. And Gallup says to focus on your top 5 strengths, just because trying to take on all 10 at once can be somewhat overwhelming. So that's why they recommend that you really focus on your top 5, because they are your top 5. So they're your greatest strengths, if you will. I like to look at your full 10 because they help you understand kind of how your strengths look as a whole, and then also how your strengths affect each other. So I find if I only look at my top 5, I'm actually kind of missing out on some key points about my strengths and my personality. In particular, I would say for me, all of them really, but perhaps the discipline, actually, and election, I kind of miss those if I just look at my top 5. So that's just important, just as a side note. In terms of what the cutoff is for your strengths, some people find that 1 through 8 really resonate, and then 9 through 10 do not. And then for other people, they find that actually 1 through all the way up to 15 actually make a lot of sense to them. And the way you'll know whether or not this is true is if I were to ask you a question about one of these strengths and it kind of equally applied to all areas of your life, right? So for example, let's take deliberative. I have as number 21. That's kind of in the middle. So what that means is that I might really take some time to make a decision and figure out all the possible pitfalls in a decision that we might make in some areas of my life, but not in others. And that doesn't mean I couldn't do it in all areas of my life. It just means it would be potentially energetically draining. So when I mention energetically draining, this is the other really important part about strengths, is that they not only allow you to, produce amazing scholarship and everything, but they actually allow you to act in what we might call, Gay Hendricks calls your zone of genius. I like to call it your zone of magic. The more you're operating in 1 through 10, the more energy you're going to have, and the more amazing things that you'll produce. And I don't just mean in terms of quantity, I just mean that you'll just be producing great things, right? So, and you'll probably feel better too, right? And be in a better mood because you're actually playing to your strengths, and those are energy giving rather than energy draining. So basically, the farther you get down on your strengths, the more of an energy drain the strength will be in terms of whether or not you're using it. So when you look at numbers 30 through 34, some people think, oh, those are my weaknesses. These are not your weaknesses. Weaknesses are a different discussion. Your strengths 30 through 34 are things that you can potentially do and actually do them quite well. The question is, do they drain you? And the answer is usually yes, if you're doing 30 through 34. So, for example, woo stands for winning people over, and this is a classic networking kind of skill. So someone goes into a party and immediately goes around and becomes best friends with 10 people, introduces themselves, has great conversations, and really thrives on that kind of energy. So for me, that's number 32, and what that means is I could do that, but I really wouldn't last very long, and afterwards I would need to recuperate because it would really drain me. So that's how you want to look at 30 through 34. So I find a lot of my clients sometimes find themselves in positions in academia where they have essentially been bamboozled or forced into operating in their 30 through 34 range. And if that's you, then what you need to do is figure out, okay, how can I delegate or eliminate these types of roles that I'm playing and minimize them so that I actually have energy? Because if you're operating all day in 30 through 34, you're going to be completely drained and burned out very quickly. And your top 10 strengths are just not even going to matter. They're not going to come into play at all. So you really need to make sure that you pay attention to 30 through 34 in the sense that you just don't want to be operating in there very often. Finally, I will say that on your report, you'll notice that there are different colors for different domains. There are 4 domains that Gallup has identified. So depending on your report, there'll be different colors. On this report, purple is executing, which they just mean that you're executing your strengths, it means that you're executing your tasks. So this is just your ability to actually implement something, right? Your blue are your relationship building strengths. Your green are your strategic or thinking strengths. So these are all the things that go into decision-making processes and being deliberate and so forth. And then finally, your yellow are your influencing strengths, which have to do oftentimes with how you're interacting with others. And they're different than relationship building strengths, and these have to do with how you get teams to, for example, to motivate teams, right? Or groups of people. And so it's slightly different, but similar to relationship strengths. So one thing to note about this is that oftentimes when clients are introduced to this concept, they immediately look for, of course, our brain looks for the negative, right? What's wrong with us? Unfortunately, that's why we're talking about strengths and what's right with us. So we look to, okay, like for example, in my report, I have very few yellow influencing strengths close to the top. In fact, I don't have any in the top 10. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that I can't influence people or that it's draining for me to influence people. What it means is that these types of strength themes tend to show up in these areas of life more often, right? So we use them and apply them in these areas more often. It doesn't mean that we can't use them in these different domains, right? That they go out of their domains into other domains. So in the example of influencing, I can look at how I can use my strengths to actually influence others. And for me, that's oftentimes through writing. And so if I'm really focusing on writing and how can I use writing to influence people and how can I use my individual strengths to do that, then I'm operating in the influencing domain. So it's not like you're missing something or that you have too many of one thing if you have particular colors in different areas. All right, so let's move on. So this is just your basic report. And now once you have your report, what you're going to want to do is learn more about each individual strength. So Gallup calls this name, claim, and aim. And the way I like to think about this is that you need to first name your strengths and recognize what your strengths are. And I cannot urge you strongly enough to go beneath the actual word that Gallup uses, because oftentimes it's very misleading. In fact, I would say most of the time it's misleading. They're just using a word to kind of summarize what this very complex strength means. And each strength in and of itself is not isolated from your other strengths, right? So again, how your strengths interact is really important, because if you're a learner and you also have empathy, those two strengths are going to affect each other, as opposed to learner and woo. It's going to look very different. So you need to do that, and just understand there are some words that are really misleading. So for example, discipline, we often think of discipline as willpower and just sort of powering through things, right? Like you can just get all these things done. That's actually not what the discipline strength is about. The discipline strength has to do with attention to processes, details, and routines. It doesn't really necessarily mean that you have willpower per se, okay? So then you want to go ahead and claim the strengths, and this is really important for you as an academic audience, is to take these strengths and claim them for yourself, right? So what this means is thinking about, how can I rename these strengths or reframe them in a way that really resonates with me, right? And my lived experience and what I think of as my writing strengths. So I had a client, for example, who kind of rewrote and tweaked her strengths into individual affirmations that she uses every day, which is great because it's just simply a reminder of her in a way that resonates for her to use her strengths every day, to learn more about them and to practice them. Aiming has to do with aiming your strengths, particular set of strengths or one strength, at an issue that is coming up for you that's a challenge, right? So you're just really having trouble finishing this article, right, that you've been writing. And so what you want to do is use your strengths to diagnose what's going on, right? Is there something about the way that you're approaching this subject that doesn't align very well with your strengths? Are you, for example, if you're high in woo and you're high in a lot of influencing and relationship building strengths, and you feel really isolated, then you may need to take another look at how you set up your writing processes and so forth, right? So again, it's just an opportunity to practice your strengths in this iterative, nonlinear process. Okay, so finally, let's talk about how strengths apply to your writing specifically. So there are four major areas, I'd say, where strengths can help you refine your writing processes and help you enjoy your writing more and produce things that you're really proud of. There are probably more areas. These are just four to think about as food for thought. So the first area is process. Process just refers to how often you write, for how long you're writing. Are you writing 30 minutes a day? Are you writing 2 hours a day? Do you like to write every other day? Do you like to switch up your different tasks, right? Do you like to write on multiple articles at once? Do you have writing rituals? Do you like having writing rituals? How do you enjoy your writing? Like, do you have things that help you enjoy your writing? That's all process and what we could call performance, okay? And you can imagine that your strengths will have a big impact on this piece. So I'll give you one example. I work with a lot of clients, and this includes myself, who are relatively low in a strength called adaptability. And adaptability has to do with liking to have tasks and events come up kind of almost out of the blue during the day, and then you have some time pressure to get it done. So a classic example of someone high in adaptability would probably be an emergency room doctor, right? There's all these new kinds of problems cropping up all the time, and they have to respond really quickly. For someone who is low in adaptability and high in some other strengths, such as, let's say, intellection, deliberative, or discipline, and some others, you would not do well in a situation necessarily where you're being thrown writing tasks just like all over the place, right? Or you're just kind of trying to cobble together, like, I'll write sometime, I'll write another time, and like your whole schedule is out of whack and you don't have any sort of routine. So those are things to understand about your process, right? And I think there actually are some writers who are very high in adaptability, and they feel kind of bad that they're high in adaptability because they really thrive on having last minute deadlines. Whereas a lot of us just do not thrive on having a lot of last minute deadlines. And the point is to just understand which sort of category you fall into and then embrace it, right? And not feel like there's something wrong. So content refers to your subject area, right? So this could refer to the specific subject area like you wrote your dissertation on and now you're researching in. It also refers to whether or not you're sort of housed in a very specific discipline or whether you're interdisciplinary in your approaches, qualitative, quantitative researchers, research design, methodology, the kinds of questions that interest you, the kinds of questions you ask, the kinds of ways that you go about completing an analysis and constructing an article. These all have to do with content, right? And you might be wondering, how are these related to your strengths? Well, they actually can be very much related to your strengths. I'll just give you one quick example. There's a strength called connectedness, and that has to do with sort of intuitively seeing the connections between things and consequences that follow. So I'm high in connectedness. That means when I read the news, I can immediately see the impact of one news story, something that happens. I can see the impact that's going to have like on a global scale. I can see like all of the sort of dominoes falling, right? And that means that oftentimes I'm really interested in interdisciplinary subjects because I can see intuitively the connections between things. And so oftentimes I feel kind of stifled if I'm just in one sort of disciplinary silo. And that doesn't mean that you're not necessarily going to be attracted to interdisciplinary work if you're not high in connectedness. There may be other strengths that are kind of pointing you that way. That's just an example. 3 is collaboration. So collaboration has to do with, obviously, collaborating in the classic sense of your co-author. So I've co-authored many times, in particular with someone many times, and we were kind of intuitively understanding each other's strengths. But when we actually sat down and looked at each other's strengths reports, then it became very clear why we enjoyed certain kinds of tasks and other kinds of tasks were really kind of like we would hit a brick wall or we wouldn't get them done for some reason. And we weren't even necessarily consciously doing that. It was just sort of like these things weren't getting done. So that was super helpful because then it became very easy for us to kind of divide up the tasks and to honor each other in doing that. It also sort of helps with communication because it's sort of like, well, you know, you're strong in these areas and I'm strong in these areas. And so you begin to appreciate each other, again, rather than looking at what you're lacking or what they're lacking. Collaboration also refers to the writing process as a whole and the publishing process. So how do you collaborate? Do you like collaborating with others in your daily writing practice? Do you have a writing buddy? Do you like writing next to somebody? Do you like having someone online? Depending on when you're watching this video, do you like writing in a large group of people, right? All this different stages. How do you interact with editors, like an editor like myself? Do you like having that kind of feedback? Do you have like a large network of people that you're constantly asking for feedback from, or you rather just wait until you get almost to the end? How do you interact with journal editors, reviewers, university press editors? All of that can be impacted by your strengths. And then finally, outcomes. I didn't know how else to frame this. So outcomes just means, you know, how fast you produce articles, and how fast you publish them, how fast you do your research, right? Like, so how many are you actually producing? Because that's important for you pre-tenure. As you go post-tenure in particular, and you kind of get off the sort of treadmill, if that's not your strengths, then you have the chance to sort of recalibrate and figure out what actually were your strengths to begin with and how to use them in your writing process now. So if you are high in intellection, you need more time to think about your writing and your ideas. And that means that sometimes you're going to produce a article that has the same or greater impact as someone else who produced 5 articles on the same subject. Both are valid. and both reflect different kinds of writing processes, right? So it's kind of like making peace with what you're producing and then focusing on that as a strength to produce something amazing. Because if you're high in intellection and you're trying to just churn out articles all the time, then that may be really challenging for you, and you may be drained by it, and you may not be producing what you know is your best work. So embracing this and accepting it can really make your writing process so much easier, and don't we all need that in our lives? So I hope this was helpful for you in understanding, having a basic overview of your strengths. And if you want to learn more, you can find my webpage, which is listed in the description. Also my email, and then my email list if you want to be notified of any upcoming events related to your writing superpowers. Thanks for joining me.